Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. In one of our recent videos, we spent time talking about why God would allow tragedy in the world around us, especially if He's powerful and benevolent. But what we didn't really talk about is how we should respond whenever we see tragedy occurring, whether that's some sort of shooting or violence, or whether it's some sort of natural disaster like a flood or a tsunami, or maybe it's an epidemic disease or something like that. How should we respond? Now, if you pay attention whenever tragedy strikes and you watch closely, you'll see a number of different responses that people give. Some people just fold their hands and don't really do anything. They say, I'm just one person, I can't really change things, and so I'm just going to keep living my life. Other people rush into action. They try to be helpful and encouraging. Maybe they go there in person to where the tragedy occurred, and they try to offer some sort of aid or humanitarian relief or something like that. There may be others whose response is to pray, to go to God and to ask God to intervene and to help on behalf of those who are affected. And then there are others who might approach it by trying to pass laws, by going into legislation and talking to politicians and lawmakers about what can be done to prevent this from happening in the future. What I want to consider with you today is how Jesus responded whenever he saw social tragedy around him, and how he teaches us to respond to things like that. In Luke chapter 13, there's a scene where Jesus is teaching in the middle of thousands of people, and some of these people come up to him and they tell him about a group of Galileans whose blood is mingled with their sacrifices by a ruler named Pilate. In other words, Pilate kills them while they're offering sacrifices, while they're worshiping God. Does that sound familiar? You know, our culture isn't the first culture to deal with the problem of violence in a place of worship. That was something that was going on even in Jesus' day. But notice his response in Luke chapter 13, verse 2. And Jesus said to them, do you suppose that these Galileans were greater sinners than all other Galileans because they suffered this fate? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. Or do you suppose that those 18 on whom the tower in Siloam fell and killed them were worse culprits than all the men who live in Jerusalem? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. So when presented with social tragedy, Jesus' first response wasn't to answer why God would allow such a thing to happen, or to rant against the Roman government or the laws of the time. His first response was to call these people to look inward at themselves and to repent of their sins. You don't need me to tell you that that's not the kind of response that we see so often in the wake of tragedy today. And yet when you look at some of the godliest people in the scriptures, people like Ezra and Nehemiah and Daniel, it's one of the characteristics that they share in common. Whenever they're faced with tragedy, the first thing that they do is look inward at themselves. They claim personal responsibility for their role in the events going on in the world around them. We live in a culture today that's dominated by blame and finger pointing. And so whenever tragedy strikes, so much of what we see is trying to figure out whose fault it is, while doing everything we can to keep the blame off of ourselves. But can you imagine how much more productive our responses and our discussions would be if we started by looking at ourselves and acknowledging that we all have sins and failures, then repenting of those sins and submitting our lives to God? So let's take Jesus' teaching to heart here. And whenever we see tragedy in the world, instead of asking why, or instead of getting angry with people that commit violence or lawmakers or the media, why not get angry with Satan and sin? And start by repenting of the sin in our own lives and turning to God. Just a few thoughts for you to consider. Thanks for watching.